So we're going to be closing and opening a section with a button and an arrow. So by default, the section will be opened, and when we press the button, the arrow will change from the upwards arrow to the downwards arrow, and the section will disappear, but the heading will appear. And then when we click the arrow again, then the section appears again. And we're going to be doing this without AMP accordion. You could do this with AMP accordion, and it will be probably a little bit easier. However, if you just want to close and open one section in your whole website, including the component and coding it according to its specification, see how AMP accordion needs the markup to be in a specific way written. So if you only need one section and you want to have a custom markup that doesn't have to adhere to the AMP accordion rules, then just do it my way. Use actions and events like we're going to do and forget about AMP accordion. So let's look at our markup. We have the div class Clearfix. I'm using Bash CSS as a CSS framework. Then we have an ordered list, and we have a list. We have the icon here. I have taken the icons from material icons and I have tweaked them a little bit. We have the checkbox icon here, and then we have the name of the service, which is waxing, haircutting, etc. Okay, so remember, all the services are inside this div with the class of Clearfix. Okay, so right here we want first of all to include the button, and to do that we're going to be coding a normal button, and I'm quickly going to add some classes from Bash CSS. All right, classes added. These classes are only for cosmetic purposes. I mean, I just want to make the button look more like a button. And then now that we have our classes, we want to add the icon. So I'm going to fetch the icon from material icons. All right, this is the icon, and we want to change it a little bit. First of all, it's only 24 pixels. I want to increase the width to 48 pixels. Okay, so it's bigger. Remember always to make your buttons at least 40 by 40 pixels, because the human thumb must be able to reach them on mobile. Okay, and the next thing I want to do is, okay, it's already black, so I don't have to change the color of it. Okay, I want to make it accessible, so I'm going to add an area label, and I'm going to say close section. Okay, so the screen readers will read close section, and then they will be presented to click on it, but that's already achieved by using the button element. Okay, and afterwards we also want to give it an ID, and I'm going to give it an ID of close services, because what this button would do is when we click on it, it's going to close the services of the beauty salon. Okay, so this is why we're giving it the ID of close services, and this ID will come in handy later on. Okay, now let me align this button on the very right of the heading. All right, now let's start making the button work. So we want, when we click on it, the services to disappear, okay? Or we want to close the section. So to do that, the first thing we want to do is we want to give a name the section that we want to manipulate. In our case, we want to manipulate the section that holds the list of the services, and this section is held by a div called Clearfix. So we want to add it an ID, and we're going to call it services. Oops, learn to spell, Stephanie. And remember, this div holds the services. Okay, so this is why we need to add the ID of the parent element. So we have the div with the services, ID of services. Then we want to go to the button, which is this thing, and then we want to add the on attribute. And what the on attribute is going to do is we're going to tell it what action to do once it's pressed or manipulated in some way. But this, in our case, we want it to do an action once it's pressed. So we want to say on tap, and then we want to say colon, and then we want to select the element we want to manipulate. In our case, we want to manipulate the services. Okay, so we're going to say on tap services, and remember, we're getting the ID of our div containing the services. Okay, so make sure that they're identical. On tap services, and then we place a dot, and after the dot we add the action that we want to be performed on those services. Okay, and in our case we want them to be hidden, so we type hide. Now let's test it out and see if it works. Let me click the button. There you go, it is working. It is hiding the section. However, let's refresh the page. See, it's open, we click on it, and then it's hide. However, this is not exactly what we want, because we want to be able to click to hide, and when we click again, we want the services to appear. But it's not working since we're only using the action hide, okay? So instead of a hide, we want to say, toggle visibility, okay? This is a default AMP action that is allowed for all elements. So you can add it on images, divs, paragraphs. Okay, so we added toggle visibility. So remember, we're using the on attribute for the button, which is this arrow over here, and we're saying it on tap, manipulate this div that we have called using its ID and do this action. In our case, toggle visibility. So let's click on it again. It's hiding, and then let's click on it again. It's showing. Great. And remember, it's showing now and hiding because we're using toggle visibility instead of hide, what we used earlier. Okay. Now this is all good. There's a problem because the arrow stays the same. So if we hide the services, the arrow is the same, and we want, once the services are hidden, the arrow to change to the arrow pointing downwards, okay? So to do that, what we need to do is go back to material icons and get the second arrow, the one that points downwards. Okay, I have taken the second arrow, and let's style it to make it appear the same as its brother. So I'm going to give it a 48 pixels and hide and width, so it looks a little bit bigger. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to give it an area label so that screen readers will be able to read it, and I'm going to say open section, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it an ID, okay, and you're going to see why in a little bit. So I'm going to say ID open services. Now remember, this is the second arrow, the one pointing downwards has the ID of open services, and the arrow pointing upwards has an ID of closed services. All right. Okay, now what we want to do is with the second arrow is I want it to be hidden if the section is open. We want this arrow to hide, okay? So to do that, what we got to do is the second arrow, I'm going to add the attribute of hidden, okay? So this is going to hide the arrow, and then over here on tab, I'm going to give it another action and event. Okay, so we want to give this event a couple of actions, and to do that we use the comma to separate the actions we want to be performed. So what we want to do is we want on click of the button, we want this big arrow pointing upwards to disappear, and its brother, the arrow pointing downwards, to appear in its place once this section is closed. And then once the downwards arrow is clicked, then the upwards arrow appears. Okay, so to do that we go here on tab, and we're going to target the open services and the closed services. So we're going to say open services. See, we're not targeting the services, we're targeting the buttons inside our button, okay? So we're going to say open services toggle visibility, and then comma close services dot toggle visibility. Okay, now that should do it. Now let me space these out so you guys can see them. Now let's test it out, and there you go, that's working. See, if I refresh the page, on default the services are open, and we have the arrow pointing upwards that is showing, you know, hide the services. We're clicking on it, and then what's happening is this arrow is hidden. Okay, so this arrow gets the hidden attribute, and the services are not shown. But when we click it again, then the second arrow gets hidden and the first arrow gets displayed, and this is how it is toggled. And it is very important because if you see over here, if we refresh the page, I have the second arrow hidden by default, okay? And I'm using the hidden AMP attribute. I am not using display none, because if you do something like you give it a class of hide, and you define hide in your CSS, you do something like hide, you know, display none, then toggle visibility is not going to work. See, it's not working, because toggle visibility show and hide only work if you have previously hidden an element with the hidden AMP attribute instead of display none using CSS. So remember, in AMP, if you ever want to hide something on page load And if you want to open it and show it later on, don't use display none, use the hidden attribute. But there you go. This is how you open and close a section without AMP accordion, and this is how you do it with AMP actions and events.